deep river, Lord, I want to cross over into campground. Oh, don't you want to go to that gospel feast, that is peace. Deep river, Lord, I want to cross over into campground.
Ladies and gentlemen, that was a musical offering by Shanika John Jordan, an undergraduate voice student at the University of Michigan School of Music, Theater, and Dance. Let's give her another round of applause. In the spirit of letting young artistry and young artists enrich our experience during SphinxCon, I also do want to point out that at the corner of the room, we have the Mint Artists Guild, a group of visual artists from right here in the city of Detroit who will, based on their inspirations of SphinxCon as well as the finals concert, will be able to depict their experience through the visual arts and enrich our experience that way. And we thank them for being here with us. Welcome back and welcome home to many of you, and thank you for joining us for the annual Memorial Arthur L. Johnson event series. In 1950, a remarkable young man, Arthur L. Johnson, came to our hometown, Detroit, Michigan. He saw tremendous potential for this city, and for 6 decades, he worked tirelessly as a civil rights leader, ardent arts advocate, and a visionary who was most passionately devoted to our Detroit community. In November of 2011, Detroiters paid their respects to Arthur as Arthur was laid to rest. This evening, Shekinah Winters Johnson, his life partner, is with us, and we're humbled by and grateful for her presence. As we have moved forward, his legend lives on within each of us. Arthur's contributions to Detroit, Michigan, and the nation include his work at Wayne State University's first Director of Community Relations, as President of Detroit's NAACP branch, and as a champion behind key artistic initiatives in his beloved city, including the Detroit Symphony's legendary Classical Roots series. Arthur stood for everything that we hope to inspire and instill in our young people, and his legacy of equity, equal access, the arts, and social justice lives on across the landscape of Detroit's culture community as well as beyond. Delroy Lindo is also a legend, a pivotal figure both in theater and film realms. You may recognize him from his roles in films like The Cider House Rules, Heist, Clockers, or The Chicago Code. Nominated for Tony and Drama Desk Awards for his Broadway performance in Joe Turner's Come Home and Gone, his theater credits rival his film ones, highlighting his recognition by Los Angeles Weekly for his exemplary work as theater director. Whether on screen or on stage, this remarkable artist and a leader has played a leading role in arts and diversity. He takes pride in his English heritage, but has been a powerful force in entertainment both here in the US as well as worldwide. We're proud to say that Delroy has also shown tremendous generosity and grace toward a number of Sphinx's artists over the years. His distinctions are countless, and his example for all of us and our young people is a source of inspiration. SphinxCon recognizes the importance of not only paying tribute to the cornerstone of Arthur L. Johnson's legacy of social justice and human condition, but also celebrating it through the honoring of today's heroes, including this year's honoree, Delroy Lindo. This evening, Sphinx's founder and dean of the University of Michigan School of Music, Theater, and Dance, Aaron Dworkin, will lead an interactive conversation with our honoree, followed by Q&A with all of you in attendance. Without any further ado, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Delroy Lindo and Aaron Dworkin.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Good evening, Delroy. Good evening.
Good evening.
So I thought we'd spend, about half an hour or so, and I'll ask Delroy a few questions, and then we'll open it up to questions from all of you, because I think that will really liven things up just a little bit. So I thought I would, and actually...
I'd like to say something.
Okay.
Just
all
right off the bat. Listening to the introduction and the word community was mentioned, how important community was. I did not know Arthur L. Johnson, but I heard of his commitment to community. And I have to confess, not having known Mr. Johnson, I stood back there, and when I listened to the things that he was dedicated to, it frankly tripled the depth of how honored I am to receive this kind of an award, because the more that one works in the commercial arena, for me, the more important connection to community is. They go hand in hand. Commercial success, for me, must be balanced by commitment to community and the things that one cares about in terms of where one has come from, young people. And so I just want to say thank you right off the bat for this kind of an honor. I really appreciate it, and thank you for having me. So. Now you can ask your questions.
This is going to be an easy interview. And I actually have a few photos that I'd like to kind of go through as we do this. So if someone has a clicker, if they can just bring that up to me, that way I can
I'm nervous.
go through some of those. Yes.
Okay.
So, but I thought I would start out just about your own heritage. So a lot of people refer to you as a British actor. And I'm wondering, kind of in terms of your identity as a British actor, your Jamaican roots, kind of, can you talk a little to us just about your own identity and growing up in Britain?
Yes. I'm going to differ with you somewhat. Most people do not refer to me as a British actor. That's the internet, that thing, that internet. And interestingly, when my film career started, a lot of people didn't know I was from England because I was not playing English characters. The connection with my having been born in England, which I was, has really come about much more it's become more prevalent in terms of my profile in the last 10, 12, 15 years with the advent of the internet. However, having said all of that, yes, I was born in England. My family is Jamaican. Any Jamaicans in the house? All right then. Interestingly, my heritage as having been born in England has become, this is strange to say, but it's become much more important to me in the last 10 years. In 2000, I went back to London to do a film in which I was playing a Jamaican, the patriarch of a Jamaican family in England in 1960. That is, now as a result of being cast to do that film, I did a lot of research in preparation to do the film. And I discovered, while I was doing, the producers gave me a lot of research materials. I had agreed to do the film initially because 1960 in England was right in the center of my mom's experience in England. And I knew very little about my mother. I come from a generation of parents. They didn't talk to us. They didn't say anything. So I knew very little about my mom, how she came to be in England, etc. And as a result of doing the research, I discovered something, a phenomenon called the Windrush generation. This is in 2000. I had never heard of the Windrush generation. Does anybody in the room know what the Windrush generation was? I'm gonna tell you. The Windrush generation, they are the generation of people from the Caribbean who arrived into England starting in 1948. There were 400 Jamaican men. And I don't know why this happened, but there were also 60 Polish women on that ship. It was a former World War II tanker that carried these men from Jamaica to England. And it was called, the name of the ship was the Empire Windrush. It arrived into London June of 1948. Now this was all new to me. This was information I was learning for the first time in the year 2000. I was born in 1952. Therefore, I put two and two together and I realized that my mother, was part of this movement of Caribbean people from the Caribbean into England. And that generation of Caribbean people and their offspring became known as the Windrush generation. The first boat landed in 1948, and that opened up the floodgates for hundreds of thousands of people from the Caribbean, of which my mother was a part, coming to England. The reason that that happened was because many of these, virtually all of these Caribbean islands were part of what was called the British Commonwealth, which meant that all of these Caribbean citizens were also British citizens. And in the aftermath of World War II, when the English needed help rebuilding the country, they said to all of these Caribbean people, come and help us rebuild the country. My mom was a nurse. There was a huge, what's the word? Almost like a draft. They went into the Caribbean asking people to come and be part of the national health system in England. And my mom was recruited to come to England and be a nurse. That's how I ended up being born in England. In retrospect, the intention of the British was that these people from the Caribbean would come in the late 40s and throughout the 50s, help to rebuild the country, And then they would go back to the Caribbean. Guess what happened? The people from the Caribbean said, we don't have anything to go back to. And so they stayed in the British Isles, what was called the British Isles, forever changing the definition of what it meant to be British. My mother was a part of that movement. That's how I came to be born in England in 1952. I learned all of this in the year 2000, preparing to do this film. So I'm very long-winded. But to answer your question, my relationship to my heritage deepened as a result of doing this film. I then I got a master's from NYU in 2015, and my thesis was a research project that further uncovered the history of African-descended people in the geographic area that became known as the UK. This started in Roman times. I did not know that. There have been African-descended people in the British Isles pre-Roman. I had no idea. So my thesis kind of centered on the history of African-descended people in the British Isles, the evolution of racial and racist dynamics as a result of their presence, and how all of that has affected the 21st century entertainment industry. So that was my thesis. That is a very, very, very long-winded answer to your question. But I've become much more interested and aware of my heritage as a Black British person in the last 15 years, and as a result have been investigating. And we'll do a film eventually.
Yeah. Well, I think it's
and I apologize for being so long-winded.
Oh yeah, and you know, I think about many of the young people who are here and thinking about how in some ways they might find a deeper understanding of themselves as they go through their own artistic expression. Yes. Very powerful. So give us a sense just kind of about acting and theater. How did you kind of get into it? You obviously, passion, where did that come from? How did that develop?
When I was 5 years old, and I wish you had, if I'd have known, I would have given you this image to show. I was 5 years old. I appeared in the nativity play in my elementary school. And that is when I got the bug, 5 years old. And I've wanted to act ever since. I don't come from a family of actors. I knew nothing about how to go about becoming a professional actor. But it was this notion of when I grow up, I want to be an actor. Now that was important, critical, frankly, because it gave me, at that age, at that young age, a dream, something to aspire to. And there were certain times in my life when things were not going so well for me, but the fact that I had that aspiration and that dream became the difference in my life between surviving and not surviving. And I always say, especially when I speak to young people, that acting saved my life, and I mean that literally and figuratively. So again, the answer to your question is I got the bug when I was 5 years old, and that's really all I've ever wanted to do.
Wow. So as you look back on the countless roles, theater, screen, et cetera, is there a way you could identify what you think has been the most important role for you've played? Not necessarily. There are a number of important roles and phases in my life and my career. I started as a New York theater actor. I started at a place called the American Conservatory Theater in San Francisco. I then went, back to New York, and I was based in New York, and I started auditioning in the theater. And the first third of my career, I think I kind of break it up into three halves, three phases. And the first was my time as a theater actor in New York. Now, what's ironic about being a theater actor in New York is that
much of my work, many of the theater actors in New York they're based in New York, but they work outside of New York. They work as I did. They work in the regional theater. And so the first 10 years of my life, pretty much from, my life as an actor, as a professional actor, from 1979 through 1990, the vast majority of my work was in the theater. I did a couple of plays on Broadway, but I would work frequently in the regional theater. I would go to various cities in the United States and go to the local theater, and I would do plays there. The turning point of my life as a theater actor, there were two phases. The first was in 1986 when I played Walter Lee Younger in A Raisin in the Sun with Esther Rolle played Mama, and I played Walter Lee. I had played Walter Lee in 1983 not very well. I had done it up at the Yale School of Drama. At that time, the Yale School of Drama was run by a man named Lloyd Richards. Please raise your hand who knows who Lloyd Richards was. Amen, amen. Lloyd Richards had been the original director of A Raisin in the Sun on Broadway when Sidney Poitier and Diana Sands and Lou Gossett had done the original play, the original Broadway production. Lloyd hired me to do the 25th anniversary production of A Raisin in the Sun in 1983, and I was not very good. And it crushed me. Bea Richards, we remember Bea Richards, do we, from Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, one of the stalwarts of theater and film. Bea Richards played Mama. Another brilliant actor, Mary Alice, played my wife. And I was the weak link in the production. I wasn't very good. And I could talk about that later, perhaps, as to why. But I got a second chance. I got a second bite of the cherry in 1986. And I went with a production to the Kennedy Center, Washington, D.C., and it was much more successful. That was a critical turning point for me, to be able to go back and to do a piece of work that had conquered me the first time around and have much more success. So that was a turning point. That was 1986. Between 1986 and 1988, I played Walter Lee twice because of the success of the Kennedy Center production. We took the production to Los Angeles. So between 1986 and 1988, I played two roles. One was Walter Lee Younger in A Raisin in the Sun, and the other was Harold Loomis in a brilliant August Wilson play called Joe Turner's Come and Gone. That was crisscrossing the fall of 1986. I played Walter Lee. Then later that fall, I did the first out-of-town production in Boston of Joe Turner's Come and Gone. In the spring of 1987, I went back to do the Los Angeles production of A Raisin in the Sun. Later that year, I did a second production of Joe Turner's Come and Gone. Now, for those of you who are not perhaps familiar with those plays, Walter Lee Younger in A Raisin in the Sun and Harold Loomis in Joe Turner's Come and Gone are major classical parts. They are every bit as demanding technically as Othello, Hamlet, the Scottish King. They are major classical parts. The fact that I was able to do these parts over a 2-year period increased, I was going to say, my confidence. Both of those parts were extremely difficult.
Would you almost say your capacity?
They increased my capacity and my sense of my capacity as an actor. In addition to which, during those years, because those parts were so big and so demanding, I developed an ethic, a way of working, which I then took into my film work years later. And that ethic has stood me in very good stead as I made that transition from being a theater actor to being a film actor. So again, a very long-winded answer, but that was the first phase, and helped me to transition into being a film actor later on.
One quick thing, just to bounce off of that, you mentioned pretty strongly about how initially you weren't good.
In that production, I was not.
And I'm thinking about many of young musicians or other performers out there who often come out of a role or out of a performance and they're like, that was awesome, I was great, these types of things. Can you speak to just the importance as an artistic performer for self-reflection and how you have approached it?
I would say that any performer who says, as a result of doing their work, whether it be acting or singing or music, my personal feeling is that any performer who says about themselves, that was awesome, is possibly missing the fact it's never awesome. There's always work to be done. Now, it can always be improved. Now, the audience can receive the work as being awesome, but that's the audience making that determination. I would say that for any performer who thinks of themselves as being awesome, you're missing something in terms of, as you said, self-reflection, self-assessment, self-analysis, because there's always more work to be done all the time. It never stops. And as long as a creative person, you are attempting to improve, that's the journey. That's the work. Personally, I don't ever feel it's awesome. Now, having said that, there is work of which I'm really proud as an actor. And from the audience responses, I know that it has touched people. But I always feel that there is more work to be done, and work can always be improved upon.
So obviously at SphinxCon, we're thinking a lot about inclusion and relevance in communities. Where do you think theater is at? Is theater relevant in kind of this day and age, and especially for young people who always want to be doing something with a screen and electronic? Where do you think theater's at? Where is it headed?
I come from a generation of actors who, and it came out of the political movement of the 60s, and not that I was working as an actor in the 60s, but in New York in the 70s, the mid-late 70s, and maybe into the early 80s, there was a generation of actors who thought that theater could change the world. And I came out of that generation of actors. Having that ethos results in approaching one's work in a certain way, approaching one's work with a certain kind of seriousness. And when I say seriousness, I don't mean a lack of levity. I just mean a certain kind of ethic, a certain approach to the work. And maybe that has, I was going to say maybe that has been lost, but I'm not going to say that. The fact of the matter is, I don't work in the theater as much as I used to, so I'm somewhat out of touch. Theater, I feel, is still relevant. I mean, strongly relevant, because as a performer, there's nothing that replaces the communication that happens between live theater and the audience. Because in live theater, the audience is a direct part of the experience. Now, that does not necessarily mean that it is better than film, but there's nothing that replaces live theater. So, and there will never be anything to replace the live theater. So theater will never not be relevant. And there are wonderful writers writing. I mean, I know that. I'm just less in touch with them just because of the fact that I've been making my living for the camera in the last few years. Did I answer your question?
Absolutely, absolutely. So you're doing great.
I am so long-winded.
So thinking about the motion picture industry, it's been in the news a little bit lately as it relates to racism.
Has it?
So while not putting what would be the standard question of what do you think about kind of, the Oscars debacle or scandal, et cetera, I would ask, what do you think is kind of, if you will, the state of prejudice or racism in the motion picture industry, and have you experienced it during your career? And if so, how did you overcome that?
One overcomes by persisting. One overcomes by continuing to do one's work. I understand the question, and that it's a very pertinent question, but and I would say this for any artist, any creative person, were one to focus on the obstacles and the potential obstacles to one working, one wouldn't get out of bed in the morning. Because in some instances, they are formidable. And I say formidable in quotes, not because they're not formidable, but it's all relative. I consider one of the major successes in my life and my career is that I can sit here at 63 years of age, having made a living, a pretty good living as an actor, supported my family, and made a life for myself as a creative person, as a performing artist. I am aware that in some instances, I have achieved those things despite the obstacles that were put in front of me and continue to be put in front of me. I think that everybody is probably aware that in Hollywood, there are no persons of color with the ability to what we call green light a film, green light a project. And until that state of affairs changes, there are certain kinds of obstacles that will continue to be placed. Now, we all know, not only in terms of being a person of color, but for women, my God. So the racism that exists is simply, it's a microcosm of the larger society. And I understand that I'm not saying anything that, that nobody in the room doesn't know that. My personal feeling is that wherever we are in our lives, in our careers, we fight that fight. I've learned so much from this man, from Danny. I've learned so much from him, and I'll speak about that just in terms of speaking truth to power, taking one's celebrity and using it for the benefit of community. I've learned so much from Danny, and I have profound respect for him. But to the extent that any industry is a microcosm of the larger society, Hollywood is no exception to that.
Do you think things are changing?
Yes and no. Yes, they are changing because we are in a time when there is more work for actors of color. There is more work, and that's an improvement. But broadly speaking, what I would say as a person of color is that there is not enough work that examines the depth of our humanity. There's not enough work that does that. So that we get to explore and investigate for the larger culture, for the culture at large, who we are as human beings on the planet. And in that regard, there's not been enough of an improvement, enough progress.
Which kind of almost takes us to this cross-section, which is kind of what is that role that the arts, whether it's film or theater or music, dance, can play in social justice, in this impact in society? What role is that the arts can play and or should play?
I'm going to embarrass myself right now because I'm going to misquote, but there was a quote from Lorraine Hansberry many years ago, and essentially, to paraphrase what she said, the role of the artist is to speak truth to power. The role of the artist is to challenge from wherever we are certain mores of society. That is the role of the artist. And I was asked this morning, do I have a preference working for the screen or as compared to working for the theater? And I said words to the effect that, because I come from the theater and theater will always have a special place in my heart, that nothing replaces the theater for me. However, working for the screen is so profoundly powerful in terms of the reach of film and television. And there's a power there that I feel very, very honored to be a part of. I just wish that there were a broader examination of who we are, we, people of color, women, of who we are as human beings on the planet, and that were reflected in entertainment culture. Does that?
Yeah, absolutely.
I want to say one thing. In 1997, my wife and I were in Rome. This is the story that I tell that speaks to the power of film. We were in Rome, and we were going down the Spanish Steps because my wife wanted to go shopping and so on. The Spanish Steps goes down into this major shopping area, right? So we were going down, and as we were at the top of the steps, we were about to go down, and these two Italian men, one of them said, "Delroy, Lindo." And I said, "Whoa, yes, I am. How are you?" And he couldn't speak English, but he knew my name. And I thought, wow, he could not speak a word of English, but he said my name. That's the power of film. Evidently, he had seen something, and whatever it was that he had seen had made a strong enough impression that he remembered my name. That's the power of film, and that's why I continue to be enamored of working for the camera and enamored of the power of that medium.
Wow, wow. You mentioned, and we'll get, because I want to be able to get to people's questions, but you mentioned Danny Glover and a little bit, and I was wondering if you wanted to speak a little more to that, and also that there was a trip to South Africa that you guys took with some other very notable people back in '94. I was wondering if you could just speak to that a little.
Yes. This was a trip, it was literally a few weeks before the election, the first President Mandela, he wasn't president yet, he had been released, and it was a few weeks before the election, and Danny called me and said, making this trip to South Africa, man, do you want to go? And I said, absolutely. Myself, my wife, Angela Bassett, CCH Pounder, Danny and his wife at the time.
Alfred?
Alfred actually didn't go.
Oh, she didn't.
Alfred didn't go. Alfred and Danny were members of an organization at that time called Artists for a Free South Africa, and they put the trip together. Alfred came to the, we had a big press conference in New York City, and Alfred was there, but Alfred was not able to come. But we went, and we went to South Africa, and it was one of the most, I don't have the words, to say that it was extraordinary doesn't do it justice, but it really was one of the most extraordinary experiences of my life. We were in Johannesburg, Cape Town, and Durban. It was a whirlwind trip. We were there for maybe 6 days, but it felt like we had been there for 2 weeks. The first weekend that we were there, the local artists in Johannesburg hosted a party for us. And so we went to this house, and it was just, it was packed. It was packed. And at probably 1:30 in the morning, they stopped the music, and wherever you were in the room, you were asked to hold the person's hand that was standing on either side of you, and they sang the anthem. And what struck me was how much the people of South Africa had earned, the black people, had earned the right to sing that anthem. I don't know the lyrics. It's la 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 Africa, right? And we sang that. And to have that feeling of how much a people had earned the right to sing that anthem will stay with me for the rest of my life. It was that moving. That was Danny. That was Danny Glover inviting me to come and be a part of that experience. We were ostensibly, we were non-partisan. We weren't supposed to speak to any affiliations. So we met with everybody. We met with the ANC. All of the political parties, we met with them. Of course, we all supported the ANC, but we weren't allowed to come out and say that.
Right.
But we met with everybody, and it was extraordinary. The day before we left, the ANC hosted us in Joburg. We had started in Joburg, we then went to Durban, we then went to Cape Town, and ended up back in Joburg. And the day before we left, the ANC hosted us, and when then Mr. Mandela came into the room, it was the closest that I have seen to a human being gliding. It was as if his feet didn't touch the ground. And he glided into the room. And again, Danny Glover, and I had never met Mr. Mandela. Danny was very, very close with Mr. Mandela. And Danny said to me, no, you sit next to Mr. Mandela. And he gave me a seat so I could sit next to him. And as long-winded as I am, I had no words when I sat next to Mr. Mandela. Angela Bassett and I were the crybabies on the trip. Every 3 minutes, we were just crying. In Soweto, one morning, we visited a church. There's a wonderful South African performer, Johnny Clegg. And Johnny was with us, the white South African, a beautiful man, and all black South Africans loved Johnny Clegg. And Johnny came with us, and we were at this church. And it was Sunday morning, and one of the things we found ourselves doing was explaining the concept of the ballot and the fact that, no, your vote is private. South Africans, that meant something bad. And we had to explain, no, that's your right to go into a private space and cast your vote. And it is your right that nobody else necessarily gets to know how you voted. So we found ourselves explaining this wherever we went. And on this particular morning, they had set up, oh, and the other thing was, because there are so many different languages in South Africa, everything had to be explained multiple times, and the ballots were in the multiple various languages. And we were at this church, and they had set up a mock ballot. And so we all got up and spoke, and spoke to the place was packed, and spoke about the concept of a private vote, and what one has to do to go into this booth and cast one's vote. And there was this mock voting booth. And somebody, it may have been Johnny Clegg, I don't remember, or Danny, somebody got up and said, is there anybody who wants to just practice and get up and come and just cast a pretend vote? And this black man from the back of the room raised his hand. He was, oh God, he was 90 years old plus. And he raised his hand and said, I want to. And they chose him, and he walked from the back of the room with a cane. He walked from the back of the room up to the stage, and they had to help him get up onto the stage, and he cast his vote. And you know, though I'm so sorry. You know, those kinds of things never leave one. And I owe it all to Danny, because Danny invited me to that trip. And he taught me how to take celebrity and make it useful. How to take celebrity, not only in terms of speaking truth to power, because I saw Danny and I've seen Danny over and over and over again, especially in the 80s when he was a big movie star, and use his celebrity for the benefit of community. And I've learned a big lesson from Danny in that regard.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that story. Yes. So I want to be able to get to any of your questions, and I think we'll have those mics for those. I just had one last question
Sure.
that I wanted to ask, and what you have shared with us is really just amazing and incredibly impactful. And this honor and this lecture relates to Arthur Johnson, who is wonderful, an incredible civil rights leader and leader at the cross-section of arts and social justice here in Detroit. And I had the opportunity a number of years ago to ask him this question, and I wanted to share with you what he said, and then ask this question of you as well. And this is Arthur Johnson. And I asked him, I said, Mr. Johnson, Dr. Johnson, what has been the single most important factor that has enabled you to live the life you have led?
Never be satisfied with simply doing what is required, do more than what is required. The path to greatness is a path made by those who are willing to do more than what is required.
Doing more than what is required.
So Delroy, you sit here, at the forefront of the film industry, theater, in many ways community leadership in our country. What is the single most important factor that has enabled you to live this incredible life that you've led?
So, directly piggybacking, stealing, if you will, what Mr. Johnson said, how do we each of us interpret doing more than what is required? How do we each interpret that? And, excuse me, for myself, it has involved asking myself the question, I think, and I'm kind of making this up as I go along, and I want to be sure that I'm truthful. I think it has involved asking myself the question, what can I do and where? What can I do and where? That saying, to whom much is given, much is required. And while I don't have the footprint that Danny has, because Danny has made it his business to reach out internationally. For myself, in asking myself, what can I do and where? I've worked perhaps in smaller ways, but I'd like to believe no less significantly. Mm-hmm. And if I ask myself the question, what can I do and where, and I answer that question, then I'd like to believe, for myself, I'd like to believe that it will bring me to places, to people, to situations where I can make a difference. In having a greater understanding of my mom, who came from the island of Jamaica, all the way to England, and then to Canada, all the while suffering in ways that as a young person I was not aware of. I've become much more aware of the kind of suffering and the obstacles that were placed against my mom. A few years before I lost my mother. I lost my mother in 1996. My mother was at that time in Canada, and my mother was in hospital. My mother had suffered a series of strokes that would eventually kill her. I was at my mother's house in Toronto going through her papers because we were fixing the house up. And I discovered a cache of letters, and they were from various of the places that my mother had worked, hospitals that were firing her. There were 3 or 4 of them that I found. Mrs. Moncrief, we have to let you go because blah, blah, blah. But I also found the letters that my mother had written in response, saying, no, I didn't do this. No, you're wrong. You were accusing me of X, and I did not do that. And she had very methodically listed her responses. And at that point, I understood the kinds of obstacles that my mother had been up against. But she made her career. My mother was a nurse. She then had the foresight to leave England. Had my mother not left England, I would not have had the opportunity to leave England. And so and have the life and career that I have. And so, in looking at my mother's life, taking from my mother's life and the example that my mother set, and when I say the example that my mother set, it was a de facto example. It wasn't my mother sitting me down and saying, you must, it was looking at her life and looking at the connection between my mom's life and what I have done with my life. These are the things that have enabled me to do what I do. And as long as I continue to ask myself the question, what can you do and where? The work will never be done. I will always be, hopefully, striving to improve, not only as a creative person, but my impact in life on other people, the people that I come into contact with. And as long as I keep doing that, I feel that I will be making some kind of a difference. And I'd also like to believe that on some level, I lead by example. And what I mean by that is the fact that I've had a career, I continue to have a career, and hopefully some young person will look at that and say, well, if he can do it, maybe I can. So.
Ladies and gentlemen, Delroy Lindo.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Before you open up the floor, I'd like to say something else. I've been talking all night. This morning, when I went to the concert, the three young people, laureates, the laureates. I had a number of responses. These three young people who, by virtue of the skill that they demonstrated, the passion that they demonstrated in their work, for me, spoke to, one was 13, one was 16, and one was 17, spoke to, my God, these young people at this young age demonstrating this kind of commitment, discipline, focus to an endeavor is profound. And the fact that they can, I'm seeing some of the musicians that were here, that were in the orchestra, the fact that they get to commune in this kind of a creative endeavor. And they only, the conductor spoke about the fact that they'd only gotten together for a half hour or some very, very short period of time last night, which speaks to the level of artistry of each one of those musicians, which in turn speaks to the level of artistry and commitment that Sphinx stands for. And as I sat there this morning, all of that, it was déjà vu. And I was recalling the impact that Sphinx had on me when I first saw the concert that you guys played in Pittsburgh. And many of us, you know, if anybody who is alive and reads a newspaper or watches television knows that, you know, Detroit has had a hard way to go in the last few years. But the fact that an organization such as Sphinx is in your midst doing the things that you're doing, and I'd like to believe that the commitment to changing, the commitment to diversity, changing the complexion of classical music, figuratively and literally, is an example of speaking truth to power. And it is extraordinarily significant that this organization exists, that it exists here in Detroit, in a city like Detroit, and that it stands for what it stands for. And I'm done now.
So I know we're running a little late on time, but I would love to be able to take a few questions. So I think we're using the microphones that are both just there and there. So any questions, just feel free to walk up to the microphone. I think we can take a couple. All right.
I don't have a question. I just need to applaud my brother for your humility and your skill and your capacity to demonstrate it. So many people speak it, but you don't see it. So in listening to you, I'm sitting here saying that we are the key to the next generation of young people who not only hear humility, but see it. And in your greatness, when you are able to demonstrate that in your greatness, within your greatness, that is not human humility, that is divine. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Lindo, for this. It's meant a great deal. I had a question about a genre of music that I personally am a big fan of, ska music, which was the musical hybrid that resulted when Jamaican immigrants sort of commingled with English working class. And so, in your estimation, would it be the Windsong generation that helped to make that musical hybrid possible?
Windrush, yes, absolutely. Interestingly, there are a number of BBC films that actually filmed the Caribbean immigrants getting off of the various boats coming into England. One of them is a man named Lord Kitchener, who was a Trinidadian singer, and he was singing this song as he got off the boat. But the answer is yes, because Lord Kitchener as an example of how the musicians, the creative people, brought from the Caribbean their work, their world, and it, as you said, commingled with the working classes, and we then have reggae and the various other musical forms. And it's extraordinary. You know, I had this thought a month or so ago that I, having been born in England and of Jamaican heritage, two relatively small islands that have produced the most extraordinary music, punching way above their weight in terms of their influence on world culture. Because when you look at somebody like Bob Marley, for instance, one recognizes that his impact, his cultural impact, is an international one. And he came from Jamaica, spent time in England. So again, a very long-winded answer to your question. The answer is yes.
Sure.
Thank you.
Yes.
Hi, I just wanted to say thank you so much for being here. And as a fellow granddaughter of a Jamaican, my family didn't move to England, but they moved to New York and about the same time. So it really kind of inspires me to go and look at my family. But my question's a little silly, not really silly. What was the role in the nativity play that hooked you?
I played one of the kings, right? I played one of the... But what was ironic, the grand irony of that experience was that I didn't want to do it because they made me wear these earrings. And so I don't want to wear an earring. And so I was walking down, I remember, this is a true story. I was walking down the aisle, right, We three kings of Orient. And I was shaking my head trying to shake this earring off. So here it is all these years later, got the earring going. And I played one of the kings.
Thank you all so much. Delroy, Lindo, thank you so much. And I would now like to ask Shekinah Johnson and Afa Dworkin to join us on stage to present you with the Arthur L. Johnson Memorial Lecture Award.
Thank you so much.
This evening, we are in presence of our guest of honor, Shekinah Johnson, who herself is a leader in the world of education, arts advocacy, and social justice, and it is a thrill to have her here on stage with us. Delroy Lindo, in recognition of your extraordinary achievements in the world of film, theater, community advocacy, and your role of inspiration for young people, it is our honor to, on behalf of Julie and Peter Cummings Foundation, as well as the Sphinx organization, to present you with the annual Memorial Arthur L. Johnson Award.
Thank you. So, ordinarily one would give a speech, but I've been talking for an hour, so I'm not. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for coming and helping us open and celebrate the 4th Annual Global Convening on Diversity and Inclusion in the Arts. I invite all of you to join us outside of this room for the opening reception. Thank you for coming, and I'll see you tomorrow morning bright and early.